Ladies and gentlemen, as you've heard, I've had quite a few years involvement with the EU, and let me, though, at the outset be very clear that what I'm going to share with you today are my views. They're not the views of the New Zealand government. I'm not involved with the New Zealand government anymore. I don't work for the New Zealand government anymore. I retired from my role as High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and Ambassador to Ireland back at the end of March this year. So I've been a free spirit for the last 4 months. As you've heard, my first involvement with the EU was when I was marketing dairy products from New Zealand Dairy Board around Southern and Eastern Asia. And, the EU was very much part of my daily life then. The reason why I was, responsible for a period of time there for what we called the milk plants around Southeast Asia, the major milk recombination plants. They'd buy skim milk powder and anhydrous milk fat from New Zealand and recombine that back into various milk products because they couldn't import restrictions restricted how developed a product they could import into those Asian countries. They could import the raw materials, if you like. And the problem we had with the EU was the EU, of course, not only subsidized dairy farmers to produce dairy products, but they then subsidised exporters on top of that to export the surplus that the European people didn't consume. And so we were competing with twice subsidised product, if you like. And the level of export subsidies would change from 1 month to the next, and so influence our whole competitive position in our marketing activity around the region. So I've got to say, I suppose initially I had a somewhat jaundiced view of the European Union, or the EEC as it was back in those days. Then, of course, when I became Minister of Agriculture, I became much more involved in trying to encourage reform of the Common Agricultural Policy that was responsible for these subsidies. And because it was causing, not only was it causing New Zealand a problem, the Common Agricultural Policy was causing global economic development a problem, because so many developing countries go through a phase of agriculture being important to their development. And so the agricultural part of their economy is crucial to their development. And if they can't trade in agricultural products, then their development is stymied, if you like. And the Common Agricultural Policy has had a very negative impact on global development for that reason. And of course, it's not been good for the EU either, because when you protect and subsidise sectors of your economy, you actually have a negative effect on your own economy. And I can talk more about that later if you like. So when I then became International Trade Minister, I was involved with a group that at least tried to encourage the EU to what we call decouple the subsidies from production, so that they weren't causing more agricultural produce to be produced through the subsidies. And we achieved that in the early 2000s. I think it might have been 2002 that finally it was agreed in the EU there to decouple the subsidies from production. So you can see that in my past life, I've kind of been involved in a fairly negative aspect of a relationship with the EU that's kind of, I guess, been a result of the Common Agricultural Policy more than anything else. And then more recently, of course, I've seen the EU from the inside as I've been High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and Ambassador to Ireland. And having been a little bit critical, let me be absolutely clear on this issue. And that is, the EU is hugely important. And in many ways, the EU has been a significant success, because for more than a generation now, the EU has kept peace and stability across Europe. And that's been a huge success, because for generations, for hundreds of years, Europe's been torn apart by conflict, originally probably based on religion, and in more recent times based on political ideologies. And so to keep peace and security in Europe has been a tremendous success for the EU. And I want to make that clear, that I support what the EU's achieved hugely, because I might make the odd further critical comment. So where's the EU at these days? What influences EU thinking? And I've got to confess, I didn't understand this fully till I got to the UK and Ireland. In my past, I thought the EU was basically a common market. After all, that's what Britain joined. Britain joined the common market back in 1973. It was actually the European Economic Community, but we called it the common market. And I sort of thought the EU was really a common market. But actually I was wrong. It's much more than that. It might have been a sort of a common market when it first started back in 1951. What was it? The European Coal and Steel Community. And then in 1957, when it became, with the treaties of Rome, became the EEC, it was still essentially a common market, I think, at that point. But with the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the EU became much more than a common market. And of course, the Maastricht Treaty requires members to adhere to aims of political, economic and monetary union. Political union. The EU is now much more of a political project than I had realised. Because of my past involvement, I thought it was more a common market, and yet I now understand that it is much more of a political project than I had previously appreciated. And I've got to suspect quite a few British people thought when they were entering the EEC, signing up to the EEC, they really believed they were joining a common market, not a political union. And I think that possibly has had some influence in that recent referendum. But what are the EU's challenges today? And I'd list a few. First, I'd say, you know, if you look at the four freedoms of the EU, the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour, that's basically freely interpreted around the EU as free movement of people. This is a bit of a challenge. In the old days, when when it was a member of six places in the old days, the EEC, free movement of people wouldn't have been a huge issue. With 28 quite disparate economies now making up the EU, the free movement of people can see really significant flows of people from countries that are not doing so well economically into countries that are doing better economically. And in the EU, you've got plenty of examples of that. And I guess, you know, what's kind of highlighted the problem more recently has been the refugee crisis. As those people have been able to sort of flood across Europe, it's really highlighted the challenges they face with the free movement of people. Second problem I identify, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be largely free movement of labour, but it's an issue that I think one day will have to be thought through a bit. The next challenge I would identify is the euro. Now, some people would say the euro is great, but the euro is a significant challenge because common currencies are a problem where you have very different economies. And the economy of Greece is so different from the economy of Germany, so different. And to think a single currency can work for those economies, I think is seriously deluded. And of course, it's not working that well for those two countries. And what happens, of course, when you've got a common currency, when you throw away your monetary policy, you've no longer got your currency to be your shock absorber for economic shocks. And what happens then is your labour market has to take those shocks. And that's what we're seeing in countries like Greece and Portugal, the high unemployment because the labour market takes the shocks, economic shocks, because they don't have their own currency. If Greece had its own currency, it would have floated way down and the economy better off. And of course, Germany benefits from a much lower currency. If the Deutschmark were the German currency, it would be a much higher valued currency than the euro. And so I think that's a significant challenge. I'm not saying they should throw away the common currency, but they're going to have to do much more to bring a common fiscal policy across the Eurozone. Whole issues of how banks are supervised across the Eurozone, issues are going to have to be worked through.